Welcome. My name is Angela Davis, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, which is the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. Before we begin today's program, I have a few announcements. First, beginning June 14th, we encourage you to visit the new exhibit in the Elizabeth Dole Gallery and Reading Room entitled Missing, Then Action, An Army Wife Speaks Out. We have flyers for this program at the back of the room. Second, on Thursday, June 16th at 2 p.m., in conjunction with the exhibit, join us for a program with historian Mary McMurray in the activism of POW MIA wives and the changing roles and expectations of the Army wife in the 20th century. Finally, we encourage you to come on Thursday, June 28th at 3 p.m. for a timely program on the war in Ukraine. Military scholars Kevin Benson and Chris Marsh will assess the war to date and offer their projections on how it will progress. Today's program is live streamed and the video is available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you with the microphone. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off or silence your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Abel, Assistant Professor of Military History at CGSC.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Ethan Rafuse is a professor of military history at CGSC, and he received his BA and MA degrees at George Mason and his PhD at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's one of our Civil War specialists and the author or editor of numerous works on the Civil War, including McClellan's War. Please join me in welcoming him to talk about hybrid war in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864.
Thank you, John. As indicated, I have written on George B. McClellan, and in that spirit, it's good to see all 5,000 of you out there. Got my slide up here promoting myself. Here's the slide up here promoting the next iteration in this series. Dr. Randy Mullis will be looking at Bleeding Kansas and the British Kaffraria in the 1850s. Did I get that right? Close enough? Okay, so enough promotion of him. Now promotion of me. Okay. All right. Karl von Clausewitz famously declared that the first and most important thing a statesman or commander must do is understand the kind of war which they are engaged and not make a mistake and try to turn it into something that it is not. Now, on the surface, the American Civil War appears to be a pretty simple conflict. A conflict between two states that pitted their conventional military forces against each other in pursuit of territorial or other objectives, easily interpreted through the framework of conventional warfare, regular warfare. And that at least has been the emphasis of traditional scholarship on the war's military history. Now, to be sure, this is an important topic, and there is a wonderful book that's coming out in the fall on an aspect of it by a handsome, brilliant historian. Unfortunately, modesty prevents me from giving you their name. Now, traditional scholarship has emphasized conventional warfare, but overemphasis of the conventional war can obscure just how complex a conflict and prevent fully understanding of the war itself and present an incomplete picture of it. And fortunately, over the past few years, a significant body of literature has emerged on the irregular war, undoubtedly spurred by America's recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and going back to Vietnam. The model of a conventional war where victory or defeats is determined by the outcome of uniformed militaries engaged in conventional operations. We've had a couple instances of that. For the most part, there's been irregular warfare, and that has led to a considerable increase in scholarship on the irregular war and the Civil War. However, students of the irregular war have a challenge, and that is linking the irregular operators to the larger war. Irregular operators are usually organized and operate on a local basis. And while important to understanding the experience in localities, connecting it to the larger war, the larger course of the war, has proven a challenge for Civil War historians, students of the guerrilla war. And this has led many to, prior to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, one historian said that the irregular war was really a sideshow to the main show. And if you can't connect these irregular operations to the larger war, then it's hard to see how you consider them anything other than a sideshow to the main event, which was the operations between the armies of the Union and the Confederacy. In this presentation, I'm going to use the concept of hybrid warfare, and I will use that term even though I know Tom Huber's in the audience right now and he'd prefer another term, but Tom will get his points in a bit, and his credit here. And looking at a specific campaign in which irregular warfare was connected to the larger military operations, a larger military operation that did have a significant impact on the war. All right, the concept of hybrid war. Again, this dialogue between past and present is evident in the emergence of historians talking about this concept of hybrid warfare. In a 2012 anthology of essays on the subject, historian and retired U.S. Army Colonel Peter Mansour defined hybrid war as, you see up here in the slide, conflict involving a combination of conventional military forces and irregular forces, which can include both state and non-state actors that are aimed at a common purpose. In adopting this definition, Mansour stated he saw little distinction between this and a term called compound warfare, a concept that Dr. Huber introduced in a 2002 anthology of essays and defined as the simultaneous use of regular or main force and an irregular guerrilla force against an enemy. In a 2005 essay, James Mattis and Frank Hoffman took as their point of departure of the discussion a concept of hybrid warfare, taking a point of departure the concept of the three-block war, in which you've got an operating environment in which a conventional fight is taking place on one block, humanitarian activities are taking place on the next, and stability or peacekeeping operations are taking place on yet another block. Now, while this label may be relatively recent vintage, variations of hybrid and compound warfare are hardly new in the human experience. And yet, while there's been an impressive body of scholarship on irregular war on bookshelves, there have been few efforts to connect to a larger campaign, which is the objective of my presentations today. And that larger campaign, of course, took place in the Virginia Theater in 1864. As we know, the Union war effort in Virginia had experienced considerable frustration, 1861, 1862, 1863. And in early 1864, a man by the name of Ulysses S. Grant came east from the Western Theater and assumed the position of General-in-Chief of all the Union armies. And he developed an overall operational vision for the Virginia Theater in which you would have three separate forces. One, the main force operating against Robert E. Lee's army. This main force, the Army of the Potomac, commanded by George Gordon Meade, but with Ulysses S. Grant personally accompanying it and making most of its major operational decisions. In addition, secondary operations were to take place. One along the James River under the command of Benjamin F. Butler. This served two purposes. One, the James River, if Robert E. Lee was distracted dealing with Meade's army, the idea was the James River provided relatively should provide a relatively open line of operations to operate against Richmond. Second purpose it served was to give occupation to Benjamin Butler, who was a very well-connected political Democrat. Focus of ours, my presentation today, is going to be on the one that took place, the operation took place in another theater, and that was the Shenandoah Valley. And that initially, in May 1864, the task of achieving success in that theater was assigned to a German immigrant by the name of Franz Siegel. who had won distinction out here in the Missouri Theater early in the war, and was also considered a very politically important person in 1864, as he was very popular among German Americans who were an important part of the Union war effort and the Republican Party. Now, Franz Siegel's record had been decidedly mixed at this point. There was the saying that Siegel was this popular figure, and Germans were encouraged to sign up and fight mit Siegel. And then the joke was, over the course of the war, they ran mit Siegel quite a few times. However, in Grant's overall vision, while Meade's forces wrestled with Lee, the forces along the James River and in the Shenandoah Valley should be able to conduct operations, and in Lincoln's words, if they can't skin Lee, they can hold a leg while someone else does the skinning. So that was the basic concept. And the idea was Lee's army was the center. The main effort would be against that force, but these secondary efforts would play a very important role in enabling Union success in 1864. Problem was, things did not work out very well in May, June, and July of 1864. Now, the principal source of concern when Phil Sheridan took command was a Confederate force commanded by this individual right here, Jubal Early, Jubal A. Early. And born in 1816 and 1837 graduate of West Point. Most notable thing that happened to him at West Point was Lewis Armistead, a fellow cadet, broke a plate over his head, and Lewis Armistead got kicked out of West Point that year. Lewis Armistead, now this is going to be a theme that's going to come up. One of the things these guys have in common, the major commanders have in common, is they have very interesting college experiences. But Early had this plate broken over his head. Armistead got booted out, but eventually resurfaces to be a brigade commander and leading the picket charge. Now, Jubal Early, his forces, now the initial operations that take place in the Shenandoah Valley, Franz Siegel's forces marching south from Harper's Ferry, marching south into the Shenandoah Valley. Now, a geographic feature here, the Shenandoah Valley gets its name from the Shenandoah River, which flows from south to north. So if you're going north, you're not going up the valley, you are going down the valley in line with what the river is doing. Likewise, if you're marching south, you are going up the valley because you're going against the river. Okay, so that sometimes confuses. The initial forces, Siegel's forces, marched on May the 4th. On the grand operation began. Grant marched his forces against Lee, ordered Meade to take the offensive against Lee, Butler to move up the James River, and on May the 4th, Franz Sigel was told to march up the Shenandoah Valley south toward the town of Newmarket. There he ran into a small force commanded by John C. Breckinridge, and as Henry Halleck wrote to Grant afterwards, you shouldn't expect much out of Sigel. He's running away. He never did anything else. And this is the famous charge at Newmarket in which the Virginia Military Institute cadets participate, the famous Field of Lost Shoes. If you're know anything about VMI, that's a very important part in their history. After Sigel is defeated, he's replaced with David Hunter, a commander who had a mixed record so far to this point in the war, but it was hoped that he could do what Sigel failed to do. Now, he gets reinforced, and Hunter begins moving up the valley. He reaches a town called Piedmont, where he encounters Confederate forces commanded by Grumble Jones, and he defeats them. After defeating them, he pushes further up the valley to Stanton and Lexington, and there he burns the Virginia. His most famous action was to burn the Virginia Military Institute when he arrives there. And things are looking okay, but then Robert E. Lee decides that this is unacceptable, and he orders the Confederate Second Corps, commanded by Jubal Early, to move from the Richmond defenses to the Shenandoah Valley, a scene where Jubal Early's forces had, under Stonewall Jackson in 1862 and under Richard Ewell in 1863, had won decisive victories. And the idea was, under Early, this unit had a record of history in the Shenandoah Valley. Many of the soldiers came from that region, and hopefully in 1864, they could replicate the successes of 1863. And at first they did. They encountered Hunter's forces when Hunter is turning east at Lynchburg and moving toward Richmond. And the arrival of Early's forces and Early's move to cut Hunter's retreat off to the north leads Hunter to retreat west into western Virginia, into the Kanawha Valley. By abandoning the Shenandoah Valley, this gives Jubal Early the opportunity to move south down the north down the valley. He crosses at Harper's Ferry in the first week of July. At Hagerstown on the 6th of July, in retaliation for the burning of Lexington, he threatens to burn the towns of Frederick and Hagerstown if they do not pay a ransom. They pony up the money, and so Hagerstown is spared the torch, as is Frederick. However, the time it takes Early to do these things enables Grant to send back the Union Sixth Corps from operations against Richmond and Petersburg. Meade's forces at this time had driven Lee's forces from central Virginia down to the Cold Harbor region and down to the region around Richmond and Petersburg. But upon Early's move into Maryland, Lincoln orders Ulysses S. Grant to order back an entire Union Corps, the Sixth Corps. It is sent back to Washington, and there's kind of a race to see if the Sixth Corps can arrive before Early's men reach the capital. At Monocacy on the 9th of July, there's a delaying action in which federal forces commanded by Lew Wallace, later the author of Ben-Hur, will fight a delaying action. And this buys enough time for the Sixth Corps to arrive at Fort Stevens and the defenses of Washington on the 11th and the 12th of July. And in combination with intense heat, Early probes the defenses of Washington. In a famous scene, Abraham Lincoln goes out there and actually watches the fighting himself. And Early decides he's done enough. He can't capture Washington, and so he falls back into Maryland. Lincoln orders a pursuit. The pursuit does not go so well. Union forces are defeated at Cool Spring, at the Second Battle of Kernstown. And in a final humiliation, elements from Early's command push north into Pennsylvania. They go to the town of Chambersburg, and they offer the same deal they offered Hagerstown. We'll burn your town, but if you pay us money, we won't. Chambersburg doesn't pay the money, and so Chambersburg gets burned. The 30th of July is a bad day in front of Richmond as well. This is the same day as the Battle of the Crater. And Abraham Lincoln decides that a visit is in order to go talk with Ulysses S. Grant at Fort Monroe, Virginia. Now, we know this meeting took place. If you read Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, they're a great book. It's a great book, but there's a number of things that Grant leaves out of his memoirs. And in his memoirs, he does not leave a record of what he and Lincoln talked about in this meeting. But it's pretty clear that Lincoln was not happy with the situation in the Shenandoah Valley, and he strongly impressed this upon Grant. And the two of them talk, and Lincoln presses upon Grant that as important as the operations around Richmond and Petersburg are, you really do need to deal with this problem up in the Shenandoah Valley. And so Grant decides, he turns to his cavalry commander, Phil Sheridan, and offers him the position of command of the forces that are to deal with Jubal Early's forces, Jubal Early's command. This is Phil Sheridan. Born in 1831, he's a West Point 1853 graduate. He was supposed to be a West Point 1852 graduate, but again, these crazy college kids, he got in a dispute with a fellow cadet, and it got to the point that Sheridan at drill had his bayonet on his weapon and threatened to run the bayonet through this other cadet, and they finally decided that it was best if Mr. Sheridan postponed his graduation for a year at West Point. Abraham Lincoln famously described him as a chunky little chap with a long body, short legs, not long, and not enough neck to hang him. And that if he had an itch on his ankles, his arms are long enough that he didn't have to stoop over to take care of it. So it must have been pretty convenient for him. Now, Sheridan is placed in command of the forces that are to deal with Early. And Grant makes quite explicit in the orders, he tells Henry Halleck, who is kind of responsible for handling paperwork in Washington and advising Lincoln while Grant is in the field, says, I want Sheridan put in command of troops in the field with instructions to put himself south of the enemy and follow him to the death. Where the enemy goes, let our troops go also. That Lincoln was somewhat frustrated with Grant. Again, we don't have much on this 31 July meeting, but that it was probably a pretty tough meeting is evident in Lincoln seeing the need to interject with Grant and saying, I read your dispatch in which you say, I want Sheridan put in command. And he says, I think your message is exactly right as to how our forces should move, but please look over the dispatches that you may have received from here since you made that order. I repeat to you that it will neither be done nor attempted unless you watch it every hour and every day and every hour and force it. So, Sheridan on August the 7th arrives at Harper's Ferry, which is at the northern end of the Shenandoah Valley, which is between the Blue Ridge to the east and the Allegheny Mountains to the west. He arrives and takes command on the 7th of August and quickly finds that he has got a problem that is not just simply Jubal Early's command. Because in Northern Virginia in 1864, there are a number of irregular forces, the best known of which are commanded by John Singleton Mosby. Mosby, born in 1833, did not attend West Point. He attended the University of Virginia. But then he had a problem with one of his classmates and ended up shooting him in the neck with a pistol and was told that you were dismissed from the University of Virginia. He used the time to appeal for a pardon, which he got, and study law and ended up a lawyer, which is what he was doing at the beginning of the Civil War. During the first year of the Civil War, he impresses Jeb Stuart for his leadership as a scout in Jeb Stuart's cavalry and wins authorization from Stuart to organize an independent force of partisan rangers. And this is the 43rd Battalion Virginia Cavalry, which is formerly a part of the Army of Northern Virginia. He quickly recruits a band of forces of men whose exploits would win them fame as Mosby's Rangers. John Mosby is a figure close, near and dear to my heart because the church at which I was baptized at in Virginia is the rectory for that church is the church where in March 1863, Mosby and his men led a raid at Fairfax Courthouse. And there in command was a general by the name of Edwin Stoughton. And Stoughton had patrols out looking for Mosby, and Mosby managed to make his way into the rectory of what is now Truro Church, and made his way up to the bedroom with some of his rangers, and said to Stoughton, who was sleeping in his nightshirt, said, have you heard of Mosby? And Stoughton says, yes, have you caught him? And Mosby's response was, no, but he has caught you. And so Stoughton was captured, and this is one of the more famous exploits. And this took place at the rectory, what's now the rectory for Truro Church, which is where I was baptized. So I heard a lot about Mosby when I was a kid. Now, Truro Church is located in Fairfax Courthouse, but Mosby's main area of operations was the Loudoun Valley. The Shenandoah Valley separates the Allegheny Mountains from the Blue Ridge. Between the Blue Ridge and the Bull Run Mountains is what's called the Loudoun Valley to the east. And that is where Mosby conducts most of his operations, where he draws most of his manpower from. And he is very much a hero to the people in that area because the main Confederate Army has been away from the Loudoun Valley for a long time, and Mosby's command provides the only real Confederate presence there. He is also quite the pest for Union commanders. He conducts irregular operations, he captures generals, he captures mules, and just generally makes things difficult. Now, there's debate among historians about how much Mosby really contributes to the war, but nonetheless, from a symbolic standpoint, the fact that there's this irregular force conducting operations so close to Washington, D.C., kind of creates an imperative for the United States government. No matter what material effect he's having on the war, they got to do something about the guy. And they sent in a number of forces to try to capture him. They're unsuccessful, and Mosby is very much a problem in early 1864, as Sheridan will learn. When Grant shows up and he meets with Sheridan on the 7th of August, gives him his orders, Sheridan quite promptly begins moving his forces south to go deal with Jubal Early's conventional forces. And as he does so, on the 11th and 15th, he advances on Early's forces. Early, realizing he's outnumbered, pulls back to behind Cedar Creek, and Sheridan follows up on him. And while Sheridan is to the south, trying to figure out how to way to get at Early's conventional forces. Mosby's men are in Loudoun Valley, and on the night of August the 13th, they slip through the Blue Ridge near Berryville, and they capture a major wagon train that's tasked with supplying Sheridan's forces. A few days later, Sheridan decides to fall back to Harper's Ferry, and is trying to figure, in part because information arrives that Early's conventional forces might have been reinforced, but there's also the significant problem of trying to protect his own rear area from this irregular force that Mosby has. Now, these irregular forces can contribute to problems for for Sigel's command and Hunter's command, and they are a problem for Sheridan's command. Excuse me. So, by the end of August, although Sheridan had taken command and issued orders indicating he wanted to conduct aggressive operations, he is still at Harper's Ferry, stymied, trying to figure out how to get at Early's command without exposing himself to the irregular threat of Mosby's command. Now, eventually, he is going to overcome this problem, and it's going to come through a combination, in part through his own actions, but also because of what happens with Early and Mosby. The Federals have become frustrated by these operations. And dealing with these irregulars, the war starts to get kind of rough. On August 18th, elements from Mosby's command will attack a picket from the Michigan Cavalry. And George Custer, who's the commander of the Michigan forces, responds by ordering the destruction of houses in retaliation. With a party of about 50 men at Morgan's farm on August the 19th, Custer's men are burning the houses in retaliation when a party of Mosby's men show up and attack them and begin shooting, quote unquote, without mercy. Sheridan's response is, out of frustration and inability to deal with these irregulars, is to begin to consider harsh measures against the civilian population of the region. On August, shortly after this incident at Morgan's farm, Sheridan issues orders declaring that all able-bodied male citizens under the age of 50 who may be suspected of aiding, assisting, or belonging to guerrilla bands now infesting the countryside will be immediately arrested by Corps and independent commanders. So this growing frustration in dealing with Early's threat and the irregular threat of the Confederates has the Federals considering and exercising much stronger action against the local population. Now, excuse me. Finally, in mid-September, Sheridan meets with Grant at Harper's Ferry, and they discuss the situation, and Grant gets intelligence indicating that Early's conventional forces might have lost some of the forces supporting them. And this encourages Sheridan, and Sheridan decides to take a much more aggressive advance against Early's command. On September the 19th, he finds Early's command position north and east of Winchester. Sheridan attacks it from the north and the east, and wins a decisive action that leaves the Confederates retreating from Winchester. Then 3 days later, Sheridan follows up the victory by attacking Early's position at Fisher's Hill to the south, and this leads to Early's command routed and defeated and retreating up the Shenandoah Valley. Now, after this, Sheridan pushes south up all the way the valley to Harrisonburg and begins conducting operations in that area as well, as Early's command retreats all the way back to Port Republic. Part of what enables Sheridan to do this is the fact that the threat from Mosby diminishes in mid-September. For reasons that are still somewhat unclear, Mosby decides to conduct operations closer to Washington, D.C. in mid-September. just as Sheridan is preparing his push against Early's command. And what happens on the 14th of September, Mosby is conducting an operation, a raid around Centerville, Virginia, which is near Washington, D.C., where he is shot in the groin, which is going to take him out of action for 3 weeks. And without having to worry about Mosby's command conducting operations in his rear, this enables Sheridan to be much more aggressive in dealing with Early's command, which contributes to the victories at Winchester and at Fisher's Hill. However, in the course of these operations, there are problems come up with parts of Mosby's command that are still in the Shenandoah Valley. And this is going to produce a confrontation between Sheridan's men and some of these irregulars. On the same day as the fight at Fisher's Hill, Sheridan directed one of his cavalry commanders, Alfred Torbay, to take 2 divisions of cavalry and move to a front royal. And the Shenandoah Valley, the way its configuration is, you have the Allegheny Mountains to the west, you have the Blue Ridge to the east, but in the center, south of Strasburg and Front Royal, you have something called Massanutten Mountain, which for 50 miles divides the Shenandoah Valley into 2 separate valleys. The valley proper to the west and the Luray Valley to the east, which is one of the challenges that federal armies face in the Shenandoah Valley, which is if they're north of Strasburg and Front Royal, it's a single valley between the Alleghenies and the Blue Ridge. Once they move south of Massanutten, it's been subdivided into two valleys. And they have a choice to take an eastern valley or the western valley. But either way they do, they leave themselves open to possibly having the Confederates use the other valley to conduct raids in their rear or attacks in their rear area. So it's been a difficult problem for the Federals all throughout the war. And what Sheridan decides, as he's conducting operations west of the valley, because that's where Early's command is, he orders Torbert's command to move into the Luray Valley at Front Royal. And it is there that Torbert's force runs into elements from Mosby's command that Mosby had left behind when he took most of his command to Centerville that led to him get wounded. And on September 23rd, near Front Royal, this element from Mosby's command, commanded by Captain Chapman, spots Torbert's ambulance train and decides to try to attack it. However, Chapman, shortly after he orders his attack, realizes he's led his men into more than he could handle. And quickly, elements from Torbert's force, commanded by Lieutenant Charles McMaster, the 2nd Cavalry, makes an attempt to block the ability of the Confederates to escape through Chester Gap. Now, what exactly happens next is not quite clear, but at some point, McMaster gets mortally wounded. The Confederates later claim that he'd been shot in the middle of an engagement. But McMaster's comrades claim that McMaster had been briefly captured and been robbed and shot by Chapman's men after he'd surrendered. Now, again, it's not clear what exactly happened, but what is clear is that Torbert's men felt they had seen enough and that they needed to do something to impress upon the world that were there going to be serious consequences for serving in Mosby's band. Now, when the fight ended, the Federals had 6 of the Confederate irregulars in their custody. And what they decided to do was to execute a number of them. 2 of them were taken to a graveyard south of Fort Royal and shot, and another was shot on the farm of Perry Chrysler, while Torbay personally attended the hanging of 2 men near the forks of the Shenandoah River. And shortly after hanging the last of them, the Federals attached a note to the corpse that said, "This is the fate of all of Mosby's men." Now, the last of these prisoners was a 17-year-old by the name of Harry Rhodes, who had just sort of decided just to ride along with Mosby's men, and in part to impress upon other people who might have the same idea of Rhodes, he was hung as well. And Sheridan declares in a letter to Grant October the 7th, this has been a problem throughout my operations. Every train, every small party, every straggler has been bushwhacked by Confederate irregulars somewhere operating among the local civilians. The people, a frustrated officer in the 2nd Rhode Island declares in his diary, are honest farmers during the day, but at night they arm themselves and mounting their horses are guerrillas. They attack our trains every day and are a perfect nuisance, a Union surgeon informs his family. I'm informed they kill the prisoners they take, but there are 2 sides that can play this game. Now, Sheridan shared his men's determination to deal harshly with the irregulars, with his frustration with them exacerbated especially on October the 3rd, when his engineer officer, Lieutenant John Meigs, who was the son of Montgomery Meigs, the quartermaster general, is killed in an ambush near the hamlet of Dayton. Sheridan is told, that if you go to the site where it took place, it said it was Confederate cavalry who did this, and there's some controversy over this. However, Sheridan's men are convinced that it was bushwhackers, not wearing uniforms, not following the laws of war, who were responsible for this atrocious act. And consequently, Sheridan responded by issuing orders directing George Custer, his cavalry division commander, to arrest all the able-bodied men in the area around Dayton and Harrisonburg, and to burn every house within 5 miles of Meigs's murder. Now, he quickly rescinded the second order, but not before a bunch of houses had been put to the torch. Then Sheridan decides, rather than risk being overextended the way Hunter was when he advanced all the way to Lexington and Lynchburg, he decides, having laid waste to the Shenandoah Valley, to retreat back north to Strasburg. And as they pulled back, Sheridan and his men lay a heavy hand on the valley's war resources. Quote, "In moving to this point," Sheridan reports from Woodstock, "the whole country from the Blue Ridge to the North Mountains has been made untenable for a rebel army." Now, there's some dispute among historians about exactly how much destruction really did take place and whether Sheridan's bark was as bad as his bite. This debate also comes with William Tecumseh Sherman as well. Nonetheless, this harsh hand towards civilian resources did seem to have the effect desired. The defeat of the enemy's conventional forces at Winchester and Fisher's Hill, Sheridan proclaimed in early October, quote, "had made the people sick of war. They expressed themselves," an Army surgeon wrote in his family from Harrisonburg, "as heartily tired of the war and now fully realize that secession has been a dear thing to them." However much civilians may have said these things to federal commanders, there was still the problem of irregulars. On October 11th, Sheridan complained to Grant of refugees from Early's army, organizing guerrilla parties and annoying me. And when further members of his staff were killed, further captured Confederates and irregulars were put to the death. Now, the point of all this was to make clear there would be consequences for anyone to think that through irregular operations that they might be able to reverse the results of 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Hill. On October 14th, Mosby, back in action, had added another entry to the catalog of Union embarrassments when he conducted what's called a greenback raid on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that netted $173,000 in 2 Union paymasters. But this would be far overshadowed in the news reports at the time when Jubal Early decided to reopen the question of whose conventional force was superior in the Shenandoah Valley on October the 19th, when Sheridan, who is headed to Washington for a discussion about strategy, because with the defeat of Early's command and Sheridan's return to Strasburg, Grant begins talking about bringing the forces that had been sent to the Shenandoah Valley in response to Early's raid back to the Richmond front. While Sheridan is away discussing strategy, Jubal Early's men manage to launch a surprise attack on Sheridan's army at Cedar Creek. In this battle, the Federals are initially driven back, and Sheridan, famously with great drama, rides back on his horse, tells the men to turn around, and what had been an initial Confederate success turns into a complete Confederate rout by the end of the day. Now again, despite this conventional victory, there would continue to be irregular problems, and the guerrillas under Mosby continued to be a problem. Nonetheless, they could not be enough of a problem anymore to reverse the verdict of what had happened at these battles. Now, there is a continuing cycle of retaliation. Mosby, in response to what Torbert did in executing the men at Front Royal, once he captures some federal troops, he has some of them executed in Bemmer Woods on the 7th of November. But this sends a note to Sheridan saying this has been done in retaliation for your execution of my men, and presumes later on in his memoirs that this must have had the effect because there were no more big incidents like this anymore. But if it did have that kind of effect on Sheridan, and it certainly did nothing to reverse the verdict of what had happened on the battlefield. Because on the 20th of November to the 2nd of December, Sheridan's going to launch a massive raid into Loudoun Valley, which was the home of Sheridan, that was the core of Mosby's command and area of operations, and conducts a huge destructive raid without any ability for Mosby to do anything to stop it. And consequently, once that's taken care of, once the defeats in the Shenandoah Valley, Sheridan is free in early December to return forces to Grant's command, secure and confident that the situation in the Shenandoah Valley, which had been so troublesome for the Federals in the summer of '64, by the fall of 1864, would not be a problem with the Federal war effort again. Thank you very much, and I will be glad to take any questions that you may have. Yes, Tom.
I might as well start off here since things are a little quiet. Well, let me say that I've always admired Mosby, so I'm glad to see him up on the screen here. As you anticipated, I have some issues with your use of the term hybrid warfare. And just by way of a little background, this idea of regular and irregular forces together, that and a complex of ideas surrounding it were first developed by us in 2002, a volume called Compound Warfare. Mm-hmm. And in 2012, those same ideas were used by Peter Mansour, and used, though, without attribution. He uses our ideas and our language 7 times in his first 3 pages with no attribution. Of those 7 uses, only 1 has a footnote, and that does not mention that we exist, still less that he pilfered his conceptualization from us. He uses the term hybrid warfare instead of compound warfare, which claims a false lineage, and it's a lineage of Hamas Hezbollah analysis as developed by Frank Hoffman and others. He does not cite us, though he uses our ideas almost word for word. He steers the reader away to a different tradition altogether. In other words, his use of this term, formerly used only for Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran-supported militias, applies this term to our ideas in order to, and he does this in aid of a massive, transgressive, uniquely transgressive plagiarism. And insofar as the use of this term for those ideas is tainted by its support for Mansour's plagiarism, I think that there would be a very good reason not to use it in this context. And this would be the more so in that your own colleagues are the ones whose toil and effort created the compound warfare volume in the first place. My question is, why do you use the hybrid warfare term?
I use the term because that's the term that's being used, that's being thrown around in the literature.
The literature about Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Shiite militias. The literature being just Mansour's plagiarized volume.
There are also essays in 2008 that appeared again after your work did. But I'm not sure I did not go back and go to footnote hunting on all of those to see how many of them cited your work or did not cite your work, which I have used. I was using the term fortified compound warfare in an essay in 2006 or 2007. But, this is the term that's being used by others in the field, and so this is the term I use.
It's widely used, but not for widely used outside of Mansour, but not for regular and irregular together. It's a very popular term. Even Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, used it a couple of weeks ago to describe the war in Ukraine. So it's definitely current and popular. That the fortified compound warfare is the thing that Mansour leaves out which is really what's dangerous, because that's what's most important. That's what will save tens of thousands of lives if the Army ever picks up on it. And so that's really where I think he falls down, and where this is a dangerous kind of botched copy of the original work. Anyway, that was my question.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that one. So. Right here up front, and then Don.
What was the size of Mosby's force at any given time?
That's a good question. It would vary. Overall it was a battalion within the Army of Northern Virginia's order of battle. It would vary depending on the operation. I think the largest that they may have had assembled may have been a couple hundred, but sometimes they'd be doing bands of a couple dozen or 50. It would just depend on who was available, what the size of the operation was. So it would vary considerably. And this is one of the frustrations that in 1862 the Federal government passed a Partisan and Ranger Act that authorized the organization of these kind of forces. And they were organized under the Confederate orders of battle, under the armies. William Quantrell's forces out here was made part of the Confederate forces by the Partisan Ranger Act. By 1864, there was considerable discontent within the Confederate High Command with the Partisan and Rangers. There was a sense that people who were serving in these forces, the joke was, Mosby and his men were in the Confederate Army, but not really in the Confederate Army, because in the Confederate Army, you had to stay in camp, you had to eat camp food, and the irregulars, though, would get to sleep in feather beds, and they would get to eat in civilian houses, and that wasn't really military service. And there was complaint that forces like this were sucking manpower, saying to people who are pro-Confederate, saying, hey, you don't have to go endure the hardships of being with Braxton Bragg, or which is multiple hardships, or with Robert E. Lee. You can go serve in the field and sleep in a bed at night, and you'll still be considered a Confederate soldier. So there was a lot of consideration, a lot of discontent. Among the Confederate leadership, there was a lot of discomfort with partisan and irregular warfare anyway, institutionally. One of the problems that comes out from studying this is, when Early and Mosby are operating in a way that complements each other, they're quite effective, like when Sheridan initially takes command. But they don't really, that happens by accident as opposed to conscious coordination. Because Early and Mosby, Early very much as a West Point graduate, military, he's very uncomfortable with irregular forces. And one of the problems they have with irregular forces is, okay, who's in the command? Who's in the command now? Who was in this operation? Who will be available for this operation? How can we plan and predict on these forces when their value is that they're unpredictable and they cannot be planned against, so that makes them effective. They become an administrative headache for the Confederate Army. They repeal the Partisan and Ranger Act, but Lee says, well, I make an exception for Mosby because Mosby forces are carrying out operations, and Mosby does, for the most part, obey my orders. But it's clear that there's a discomfort in the Confederate High Command just for the fact that how many men in this command? In one particular operation, there'll be a couple hundred in the Berryville raid, and there'll be a couple hundred in an engagement here. But how many are available at any particular time makes it a very difficult administrative and historical problem to study. That didn't answer your question, did it? On paper, there's a battalion of these guys. Don.
Yeah, to bring in another historiographical debate. To what extent is Sheridan's actions, Custer's actions and everything, a result of a logistics strategy versus a punitive anti-guerrilla strategy?
Well, they both kind of serve each other, right? You're punitive toward the civilians, making clear that, and at the same time, making clear to them that the Confederacy cannot protect you, so there's no point in supporting the Confederacy. and 2, denying the Shenandoah Valley as a logistical base for Confederate forces there. There's a famous line that Grant says to Sheridan, says, after you conduct a campaign, I want a crow that flies over the Shenandoah Valley has to carry its own provisions. And so these two things feed into each other. One, they impress upon the locals the impotence of the Confederate government to protect them from the federal power, making a case you might as well submit because you're going to lose. And 2, it denies resource base to the irregulars that they need to operate from. I mean, the logic out here, after the sack of Lawrence in 1863, Union military authority Commander Thomas Ewing issues a famous Order Number 11. The idea was to separate the guerrillas from their resource base, undermine the resource base, undermine the guerrillas, which did not have the effects he hoped for, but still lingers on in the memories of people who live in on the other side of the border, not this one. This is the good side of the border. Mike.
Actually, we have a question.
Okay, well, then Mike, okay.
Sorry about that. Sun Tzu and like people who study Sun Tzu, I've heard of orthodox and unorthodox fighting. The term used before in like a shoot-off of Sun Tzu's Art of War. So this guerrilla fighting by Mosby, is he fighting this kind of, has he read Sun Tzu's Art of War? Is he fighting unorthodox ways? Or?
I don't know of any study that he did of Sun Tzu or things like this, other than this was, he was a scout for Stuart's cavalry. He participated in the peninsula, and he demonstrated a real knack for operating independently. And he could recruit men in Loudoun Valley. He was from the Loudoun Valley, and he was a very effective leader. And so there's sort of like a natural self-taughtness to Mosby. And there's a natural combativeness. I mean, he did shoot. I don't know of any. Mosby did not study irregular warfare. Now, regular Army officers did get experience with irregular warfare out in the frontier and dealing with that. But for the most part, the curriculum was designed to prepare them for the conventional war. Mosby was not a West Pointer. He was UVA before unfortunate stuff, and was just sort of a natural kind of self-taught leader. Like I said, Stuart liked him immediately and became a big patron of his. And when they began to organize these partisan ranger acts, these partisan ranger forces, it seemed to Stuart that Mosby was the guy to do it. He had demonstrated talent. He knew the region behind Union lines and could lead men there and proved a very, very effective leader. Now, how much he actually really significantly contributed, Mosby's partisans will say he extended the war several months by forcing the Federals to hold back forces that might have gone on the front line to chase him down. But, I mean, aside from Sheridan's brief hiccups, his impact on the conventional war is somewhat hard to quantify. So he was, again, it was just this is kind of a natural extension. This guy can operate independently. He knows the region. We'll set him up there under this act. And then the act, they find in other regions doesn't work so well, but Lee likes what Mosby does. And so he continues to support Mosby's command.
But there's also a history of partisan warfare in the United States. And they've got folklore as guys like Francis Marion and Rogers Rangers and some of this. So if you're just reading the history of the United States, you can sort of see the influence of some of these folks. You don't have to be school taught to sort of breathe that in your own study in college.
Mike.
Thank you. In reference to just what Sean said, and you alluded to it earlier about Order Number 11, as you're aware, we had our own problems here in Bleeding, Kansas, along the Missouri-Kansas border. So do you think there's a connection between the troubles that we had here and the difficulties that both the Union and the Confederate forces had in the Shenandoah Valley in terms of, like, I don't want to use the word lessons learned, but as an example, because it seems to me that based on what you just spoke about, it kind of, our troubles here kind of opened up the can of worms, so to speak, for this type of activity.
You get irregular warfare where largely conventional war has been settled. Out here, I mean, the war for Missouri is pretty much settled by early 1862. So for Missouri, other than a couple operations by Sterling Price, which are not to be underrated, but those are still largely conducted as a raid as opposed to a permanent occupation. The United States government pretty much firmly establishes control of Missouri by early 1862. So if you're anti-union, right, or whatever motivation, you have no other option if you want to serve the Confederacy or your outlet, or find an outlet for violent, irregular warfare provides that. Mosby operates in areas that are behind the lines. These areas are largely, on the map, look to be blue and occupied, but largely, you know, the Union occupies a town here or there, but the countryside is largely left out there. But irregular, again, the thing about irregular warfare is it is so localistic in its character. It is, you know, the irregular war may carry parallels between what happened in East Tennessee versus what happens in North Carolina, what happens in Missouri, what happens in Western Virginia, what happens in, but it's all so locally oriented that the big challenge is, how do you connect this to the larger war? How are you again, the concept that's used of guerrilla warfare is it's a mosaic, right? It's supposed to be taken complicated, and you don't really have and it's most effective because it lacks central direction, so it's hard to plan against. But of course, its advantage is its disadvantage. It's not centrally directed. You know, regardless of what Jefferson Davis wants, William Quantrell's going to do what William Quantrell does. Regardless of what, you know, he wants, Champ Ferguson's going to do what Champ Ferguson does, in response to his local situation. So it's, I mean, there are similarities throughout, but there's no, in terms of overall, the Partisan Ranger Act is an effort to try to get that kind of coordination, but then it turns out, well, are we doing more harm than good with this by giving people incentives not to join the regular armies, and instead do this and say and claim they're doing this instead? So it becomes a big problem. Confederate military organization. Yes, these guys can be effective. We know what Francis Marion did. We know what these guys did. But, you know, Robert E. Lee's going to have to win this war for us. Braxton Bragg's going to have to win this war for us. And, you know, just like George Washington won the war for the American Revolution. Again, it's much more complicated than that. But you do need that institutional victory to win, to be considered legitimate. And there was concern that irregular warfare tainted the Confederate cause, undermined it institutionally, and its efforts to try to win respectability abroad and at home. So, and again, and are these guerrillas serving the Confederacy? Are these just a bunch of criminals engaging in violence? And in much of the case in Missouri, I mean, Michael Fellman's book on the war in Missouri, Inside War, there's this violence in the countryside. Some of it's connected to the war, some of it's connected to old family feuds, some of it's connected to, you know, the war in Kansas. You know, how much is the pro-slavery, anti-slavery conflict just a cover for, you know, my land goes to that rock and he says that land goes to this rock. So it kind of gets all wrapped in all these. That's why you get so many great studies of individual guerrillas, individual partisans, but it's really hard to pull it together in a single study that says this is what it did to the war.
I have a more conventional question.
Okay.
And the question is, if you look at Mosby in the east in Virginia, and Quantrill on the far western edge of the Confederacy, Missouri, Kansas, they're both famous at the time. They both interact with the Confederate government in Richmond somewhat. But they have very different reputations and moduses operandi. Would you like to comment a little bit on the differences, what they were and why?
The war in Missouri is not the war in Virginia, and Wim Quantrell never got cheers from Robert E. Lee, and so that plays a role in that. And again, how much, the Army of Northern Virginia has this institutional and romantic lost cause aura around it. The war in Missouri does not have that aura around it. Although recent scholars have argued that the guerrilla war in the Civil War gets somehow married to the gunslinger of the West, and that's how it should be viewed as, the war in Missouri should be viewed less as a war between North and South than a war over the frontier. And so there's so many local differences about it. One thing that is interesting is the differences between Early and Mosby. After the war, Early becomes the big champion of the lost cause of the Confederacy. And the idea of Robert E. Lee and the conventional war and the Army of Northern Virginia, and the honorable, chivalrous war that the South fought and defeated by overwhelming forces. And it's very much in the service of the white supremacist, anti-Reconstructionist cause in the South. Mosby, after the war, becomes a Republican. He becomes a friend of Ulysses S. Grant, and becomes very unpopular in his native Virginia for doing so, becoming one of the Southern turncoats who supported the Republicans in Reconstruction. Mosby also what also makes Mosby interesting is going back to college. Mosby lives a long time, and he lives into the 1890s and 1900s, and he is really, really made upset by how violent college football is. And he tries to get and when there's efforts to try to ban college football in the early 1900s, Mosby is a big supporter of getting rid of it because he views it as just too violent. This guy who'd killed a number of people with his bare hands and carried out these operations. And it's amazing how much he and Grant become very, very good friends after the war, and very much reconciled with the people who defeated him. Juba Early does not become reconciled to the results of the war, at least in terms of Grant and Reconstruction. So they're interesting about Early. One of the things interesting about looking at their cooperation, lack thereof, in dealing with Sheridan, is how much their memories of what each contributed is wrapped up in the animus after the war, and how much they really, really did not like each other. But it is clear. It's clear. Early, even before, comes with the West Point perspective, the regular perspective, and he's not really comfortable with the irregular forces, and does not really make much of an effort to coordinate. Mosby makes a visit to Early's headquarters in the beginning of the campaign, but there's really no effort to coordinate with each other, which contributes to Mosby's decision, okay, in September I'll just go right off to Northern Virginia and do something there, which is when Early really needs him, when Sheridan makes his determined push.
When Sheridan orders the detention of males under 50 and prisoners are executed, did that have political blowback in the North during a presidential election year?
The correspondence is taken, most part of the North in 1864 is waging a hard war in the South, and they're accepting it's going to be a hard war. Whatever reservations there were in 1861 or 1862 are being too tough on Southerners, that's been gone for a while. There is very much the Southern, Sherman in his writings, right? We tried to conciliate you guys. We tried to let you keep your slaves, and you kept on fighting. So you gave us no choice but to do this. And so much in the North there is, we've tried being conciliatory toward them, and it just didn't work. And we have to preserve the Union, and we tried to be nice. And now, if it takes rough measures, it takes rough measures. The soldiers who get killed by irregulars, who get bushwhacked and stuff like that, they got families back home who are not pleased with what's happening to their families. And they didn't send their children to go get killed by a bushwhacker or by some criminal. They sent their son to go serve in a regular army, win military glory in a regular battle, a romantic battle, not be killed by some murderer lurking in the bushes somewhere in Dayton, Virginia. Wrap it up? All right. He says wrap it up so you can take it. And I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have. I presume we've cut rolling. One more reminder. You got Dr. Mullis coming up next month. And next month. So again, thank you very much for your questions, and I'll be glad to answer any more that you have afterward. Thank you.